Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Today we are speaking with Elizabeth Maddock Dillon. Elizabeth is a professor of English who has spent her long career tracing deep histories of gender, race, and performance in the Atlantic world around the 18th century. She is a professor at Northeastern University and this year's Evelyn Green Davis Fellow. Given the interconnected nature of her historical interests, Elizabeth's work has traced a wide variety of topics. She has published on, among other things, Barbary pirates, theater as an 18th century political forum, zombies, aesthetics, and the constructions of gender in the literary public sphere. Elizabeth has also done critical work in the digital humanities, helping to establish archives and protocols for preserving and publicizing historic data. She is a co-founder of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive, a collection of early colonial Caribbean texts. The archive exists to make documentary materials more accessible to researchers and develop further understanding of colonial Caribbean cultures and literary histories. Elizabeth is currently working on 2 books. The first, titled Gender and Racial Capitalism, Atlantic Geographies of Sexual and Social Reproduction, explores how the colonial plantation systems of the early Caribbeans shaped structures of gender and race present in Western modernity today. She has recently published 2 portions of this book, including the article titled Zombie Biopolitics. The article connects the experience of slavery as a form of living death on the sugar plantations of Barbados in the 17th century to the zombies' origins in colonial Saint-Dominique. A second article links traditional Western binary accounts of gender to the deep history of settlers' colonialism, property and labor regimes of early capitalism pioneered on Caribbean sugar plantations in the 18th century. Her work at Radcliffe this year has also turned in a new direction. She's now working on a book about the history of sweetness, as told through 3 sweet substances: milk, sugar, and honey. This book, like her other projects, turns to the early Caribbean as starting points for understanding the intersections of race and capitalism in our world. But it also traces the direct line to our present world in these histories, linking the monoculture agriculture developed on plantations to our food chain today, as well as to racial disparities in health and disease and questions of environmental justice. Elizabeth's interest in sweetness and the environment ran deep. She spent much of her childhood hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where she climbed many mountains because her parents promised her chocolate when she reached the summit of any peak. The early imprinting succeeded. Today, she loves hiking and trail running in the White Mountains, and she also loves chocolate. I am delighted to welcome Elizabeth Maddock Dillon to the podium.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for being here today, and special thanks, of course, to the Radcliffe Institute, to the truly amazing group of women who run the Institute, as well as to my extraordinary fellows who are here today. The other fellows may remember that at the beginning of this year, Sharon rather calmly promised us that the year to come was going to be magical. I have to say that I never really doubted her, but it has certainly proven to be true. And I'm well aware that that magic doesn't happen by accident, that it's orchestrated by the people who work so hard to help make that possible. So I want to thank all of them. I'm so grateful for all that you do. Claudia, Elizabeth, Jen, Allison, Sharon, Maria, Jay, and Margarita. I'm really eternally grateful. And I remain honored and still a little bit pleasantly stunned each day that I get to be in the company of the brilliant and generous humans who are fellows this year. I've really learned so much from you, and I felt so supported by this community, so thank you. Before I jump into my talk, I'd like to offer a brief warning that parts of this talk address scenes of explicit violence involving slavery and the legacies of slavery. It is disturbing material, so I wanted to let you know in advance. Okay, so milk, sugar, honey. Humans crave sweetness. This biological drive has shaped the modern world in ways that are decisive, yet hidden, vital, as well as violent. This talk and the book that I'm now writing traces the history of sweetness in vivid detail, linking our daily domestic pleasures to histories of pain and profit that are embedded within the story of racial capitalism as well as in our food chain today. Sweetness is a dominion that's most visible at the molecular level, defined by the glucose that serves as the essential energy that fuels our cells. Sugar, sucrose, honey, fructose, and milk, lactose, are historically speaking the three most readily available forms of glucose. When the glucose in milk, sugar, or honey binds with the sweetness receptor in humans, it sets off a chain reaction of chemical bliss in our bodies. The sweetness receptor, which was first found on our taste buds and later in our guts as well, was only discovered by scientists at the beginning of the 21st century, so really only very recently. But this circuitry of pleasure has a history that extends to far earlier reaches of time, and is one that reveals how profoundly this molecular circuit has shaped our bodies, our social worlds, and even the land around us. We've been schooled to think about sweetness and sugar in particular in terms of individual consumption, particularly in terms of wellness today and the wellness industry, as something we should avoid or limit in the interest of health and weight management. But in this work, I aim to displace this narrative of an individual's relation to food consumption with histories that bear on food politics and environmental and racial justice, both in the past and today. So I want to invite us to move from an understanding of milk, sugar, and honey as commodities that we might consume to much more robust stories of production. You'll notice actually how much more complex and involved these images are than these images. So this is where I'd like us to be, to think. Okay, so on the one hand, my story begins here. The first food that we consume at birth is milk. Lactose, the sugar in breast milk, is made up of glucose and galactose, and glucose is the most basic unit of energy that we need to survive. Glucose hits the bloodstream faster than any form of sweetness because it's absorbed more directly through the gut than any other sugar. But glucose doesn't just ease hunger. It also delivers a dose of euphoria by activating the opioid circuitry in our brains. It activates what scientists call a hedonic pathway in our brains. We're hardwired to desire this sweetness so that in our most creaturely state, we blindly seek more glucose to stay alive. And in fact, glucose activates the same hedonic pathway that heroin hijacks to bring about encompassing bliss. And any of you who have spent much time feeding an infant will not necessarily be surprised by the breast milk heroin connection. I know that when our daughters were small and I was nursing him, they sort of nurse ravenously with this kind of ferocity until suddenly they're satiated and then they just like collapse, right? And then their eyes roll up in their head and they, and this little smile. And my husband and I used to call this lactoland. While milk may deliver our first fix of straight-up glucose, the hedonic pathway quickly becomes well-worn when we consume sugar, honey, and all manner of food that's infused with more glucose than milk. Honey's the sweetest and historically most readily available additive of glucose to our food. Cane sugar, once we learn to extract it from cane and to refine it, is an even more potent conveyor of glucose. So in that sense, the story that I want to tell also begins here. And this is the larger history of sweetness and modernity. This is a sugar plantation from the 18th century. The so-called sugar revolution of the 18th century occurred when Europeans discovered the immense profits that could be made by growing sugar on Caribbean plantations with the labor of enslaved Africans. Sugar production created a modern global capitalist economy by way of two fundamental innovations. First, a new reliance on enslaved laborers kidnapped from Africa, and second, a newly developed system of large-scale agricultural monoculture. Sugarcane was not grown in the Caribbean to be eaten, and this matters a lot. It was grown to be shipped and sold elsewhere. As archival evidence shows, enslaved Africans who dared to eat the sugarcane that they were forced to grow were subject to horrific forms of corporal punishment. This story of sweetness and modernity reveals a history of capitalism that is not the familiar story of industrialization, not one of mechanized looms weaving cloth in Birmingham, England, or Lowell, Massachusetts, but one of sugarcane sprouting from the fields of Barbados, Jamaica, and Louisiana. It also reveals a history of monoculture that far predates more familiar accounts of a post-World War II boom in agribusiness. Monoculture is a system of intensive extraction. It involves growing one crop and eradicating all other growth in order to produce that one crop in abundance. Starting with the production of sugar on Caribbean plantations in the 18th century, monoculture collaborated with capitalism to overtake much of the world's food production today. The well-documented problems of monoculture, from soil exhaustion to species extinction, have metastasized since then and are visible today across our planet. But monoculture is not just a problem of soil or birds or bees. It's linked as well to histories of racism, colonialism, and disease. That is, to a kind of human monoculture and its destructive effects on our world. The growing of a single crop on the plantation for commercial export was structurally dependent on the valorization and dominance of a single racial category, white European, at the expense, quite literally, of all other races and cultures. This move of associating race with what the scholar Michel Rolph-Trouillot has called degrees of humanity was necessary to effect the primitive accumulation, that is, the theft of land from indigenous people and the theft of labor from African people at the origin of capitalism. So my key points here, just to summarize, are that monoculture is both agricultural and cultural, that is social, human cultural. It produces sugar and it produces whiteness. And two, global capitalism originates in agricultural monoculture, in the idea of a more efficient extraction of a crop to become a commodity. Because monoculture invites us to focus on one thing, on the efficient production of a single commodity, it also invites a kind of blindness as well, a blindness to the complex interrelations of that commodity to the world around it. The antidote to monoculture is diversity. This is a slide of regenerative farming, but I really love this image. More precisely put, the antidote is a focus on the connections and interrelations between crops, weeds, soil, and insects, as well as the hands that tend the soil and the people who eat the food raised there. You can work to destroy these connections, as monoculture does, but they take new forms, and they persist. And in this persistence, we see great creativity and vitality in both environmental and in human terms. So how best to tell a story of sweetness that is not afflicted by this blindness? We need, I think, to understand the much larger histories and narratives that speak to the rich and ineradicable connections between land, food, animals, and people. And I will say, speaking as a humanities and literature scholar, that I think literature and art are particularly good places for us to find those larger stories and to tell them. All right, so this talk has 3 parts, milk, sugar, honey. And I'm going to start with sugar. So sugar is a commodity unlike all others. As sugar's most brilliant historian, Sidney Mintz, explains, the demand for sugar and its rate of production has increased steadily, with only the slightest of occasional dips, for the last 5 centuries. The consumption curve really turned dramatically skyward beginning around 1650. Between 1650 and 1800, British consumption of sugar increased by some 2,500%. The average annual per capita consumption of sugar in 1700 in England was 4 pounds. In 1800, it was 18 pounds. That number today in the US is more than 101 pounds. So what happened in 1650? This is a map of Barbados. I'm sorry, it's a little blurry. 1650 was about the time when English settler colonials who had been cultivating crops on Barbados realized that tobacco and cotton did not yield well there, but sugar did. With the help of the Dutch, who passed along the technology of the sugar mill to Barbados planters, the English made 2 crucial changes to their agricultural system. First, the labor that had before then been primarily that of white indentured servants was replaced with that of enslaved Africans. And second, sugar production was scaled up dramatically. Small farms were consolidated, and the system of production became intensely regimented on large plantations. Sidney Mintz calls the sugar plantation, in a phrase that I like, the first factory of modernity. By 1665, Barbados was exporting over 100 million pounds of sugar per year, produced through the labor of 25,000 enslaved Africans. Put another way, Barbados evolved from 1627 to 1665 into one of the first islands that was unable to feed itself because it was almost singularly producing sugar for a European market. The profits from sugar were so immense, wrote one observer at the time, that planters became, quote, so intent upon planting sugar that they had rather buy food at very dear rates than produce it by labor. So infinite is the profit of sugar works, end quote. So on this account, it's a little bit difficult to tell where the addiction lies, with the sugar or with the money. But in any case, the planters become like addicts, so intent on their drug of choice that they forget to grow food. Barbados produced not only sugar, but a new set of laws. Most significantly, the 1661 slave code that first identified Africans as, quote, a heathenish, brutish, and an uncertain, dangerous pride of people, end quote, who were not entitled to English liberty or to the legal status of fully human subjects. Now, this slave code was directly exported to South Carolina and becomes the basis of US slave codes and laws, and also to Jamaica, together with the plantation technology. In that sense, we can think that the technology that made these first factories of modernity productive was not the steel sugar mill, but enslaved black lives. However, for European investors in the 18th century, and particularly those far away from the humid cane fields of the Caribbean, sugar mill technology was a wonder. So you see these diagrams of all these fancy gears and so forth. But what matters here is that you see the kind of crenellated steel cylinders, and they turn against one another. Here's another image of a slightly different one. And so the stalks of cane are fed between the cylinders, which crush them and squeeze out the juice. The juice goes out the bottom into a giant cauldron where it's boiled and then condensed and then refined into the white gold of granulated sugar. But absent from these drawings are the hands of the enslaved African workers who were forced to feed cane into the machine around the clock during the short window of harvest season. Also missing from these drawings, the axe that routinely sat at the base of the machinery to chop off the hand or the arm of the enslaved workers whose appendages were drawn into the revolving cylinders together with the cane. So regular was this accident that the axe was de facto a part of the sugar mill machinery. I first saw this axe appear not in a technical drawing of the machinery of the sugar mill, but in the footnote to an 18th century Georgic poem about the glories of the sugar industry in the Caribbean. James Granger's book-length poem, The Sugar Cane, from 1764, it's kind of mind-blowing. It's modeled on Virgil's work. It's 162 stanzas of iambic pentameter, copiously annotated with footnotes, that begins by telling us how Christopher Columbus brought sugar to the Americas, and then it jumps into the soils of Jamaica, composting techniques, dung scattering, everything you would ever want to know about growing sugar. Somewhere in the middle of this poem, the sugarcane is fed into the eager mill. So this is the verse at the top and the footnote at the bottom. But Granger offers a cautionary note, quote, "But oh beware, nor trust between the steel case cylinders, the hand incautious, off the member snapped," unquote. So the footnote kind of clarifies that this member, obliquely referred to here, that snaps as if by its own volition, is in fact the hand or the arm of an enslaved worker that's drawn into the mill. And he says this accident will sometimes happen, especially in the night, and the unfortunate wretch must fall a victim to his imprudence or sleepiness if a hatchet do not immediately strike off the entangled member, or the mill be not instantly put out of the wind. So, in other words, Granger cautions that without a hatchet nearby to immediately dismember the enslaved worker, the catastrophic event of interrupted sugar production might occur. This grisly so-called accident next appeared to me as I was reading the diary of Lady Maria Nugent, the wife of the British governor of Jamaica in the years 1801 to 1806. In this diary, she describes a recreational day's outing with the island's wealthiest sugar baron, Simon Mitchell, who gives her a kind of tour of the sugar mill. The whole process of sugar making, she comments, is indeed very curious and entertaining. And then, in his kind of tour guide mode, Simon Mitchell notes that sometimes the enslaved workers did fall asleep and get their poor fingers into the mill, and he showed me a hatchet that was always ready to sever the whole limb as the only means of saving the poor sufferer's life. So why then does this axe keep appearing and disappearing? If the axe is always at the ready, is it not a part of the machinery of sugar production? There were efforts by abolitionists in Europe to make this connection between the consumption of sugar and the violence of its production. And this is actually an image from Voltaire's Candide, where you see two Frenchmen sort of looking at an enslaved man, and it says, the caption is, "It is at this price that you eat sugar in Europe." And the enslaved man has likely had his arm cut off in a sugar mill and his leg amputated for attempting to escape from his captivity. The history of limbs caught in sugar mills and snapped off by accident tells us a story of calculation, a calculation as to whose lives and limbs matter and whose do not. Racial capitalism is based on this calculus. This is a calculus that remains with us today, embedded in our food chain, in our bodies, in the geography of where we live and how we die. So how does this story relate and reach into the present? When we trace the history of sugar and of its violence, we see that the routine amputation of limbs that occurred in producing vast quantities of sugar in the 18th century is eerily repeated in the routine amputation of limbs that now result from diabetic complications, the result, in turn, of the massive amounts of sugar plumped into the bloodstream of the economy of the modern world and of our veins today. So this on the right is a kind of brilliant article that appeared in ProPublica about the Black American amputation epidemic by Lizzie Presser in 2020, in which she followed the work of the doctor who you see on the far right, Dr. Faluso Fakaridi, who has done kind of amazing work to help people who are at risk of losing, of amputation due to diabetic complications in Mississippi. And on the left is a book by the medical anthropologist Amy Moran Thomas, who writes a very powerful and really a devastating account of the widespread effects of diabetes on the indigenous Garifuna community of Belize. She describes her first encounter with really seeing diabetes when she began her ethnographic research in Belize. Visiting with a Garifuna man who she calls Mr. P, Moran Thomas begins to look through an album of family photos with him. As they flip together through the pages, she realizes that over time, even as the pages of the album fill with pictures of new grandchildren, Mr. P's wife is disappearing bit by bit. First, she has lost a foot to diabetic amputation, then a leg, and then both legs. Then she disappears from the photos. Mr. P acknowledges this harrowing loss across the pages by repeating only one word: sugar. The Garifuna are the direct descendants of the so-called Black Caribs who were forced from their ancestral lands on the Caribbean island of St. Vincent by the British at the close of a bloody 3-decade war, the Carib Wars, at the close of the 18th century that were waged with the British. The British fought this war in order to take the Carib lands to create sugar plantations. They sought this land because, this is the end of the 18th century now, they had exhausted the soil of Barbados because monoculture, and it was no longer lucrative to grow sugar there. They literally starved the Carib population to death and then put the remaining members of the Carib community on a ship to exile them from the island. The Garifuna ultimately found refuge in what are now Honduras and Belize, where today an astounding percentage of the population suffers from diabetes and diabetic complications due to the constricted nature of the food supply and a dearth of medical care. Across this history, then, we can trace a narrative in which indigenous and Black people shift from being forced to produce sugar to being forced to consume sugar, and both positions impose life-destroying effects. How is it possible to describe someone today, or even to understand oneself, as a forced consumer of sugar? What exactly do I mean by this? Well, to answer that question, let me turn to a discussion of the food chain and how we eat today. In 1967, the Ghanaian researcher Dr. Silas Dodu described the rapid spread of diabetes around the world in the late 20th century as linked to the spread of what he called white man's food, or what is now called the industrial diet. In brief, the industrial diet is one in which food is manufactured, marketed, shipped, and sold for profit, rather than grown, harvested, and prepared for sustenance. But today, it's not white men who suffer the most from the effects of this diet, but rather Black, brown, and indigenous people because of the lack of food choices and the lack of adequate medical care in today's landscape of inequality. An estimated 12% of Americans now have diabetes, over 30 million people. I myself am one of those 30 million. The best way to control diabetes is through diet, including avoiding excess sugar and exercise. But as much as we're told that it is up to the individual to impose self-discipline, a matter of negotiating with our own appetites and activities, the real story is often well outside of us, not inside. As a recent study puts it, quote, one's ability to adhere to a recommended diet may be prejudiced by contextual influences, end quote. So context, that is where we live, what kinds of foods we're able to purchase, to afford, and to cook there, matters enormously. Researchers have now pinpointed the health effects not just of food deserts, but in a new metaphor, food swamps. In a food swamp, the flood tide of sugar-infused and highly processed foods has saturated the landscape such that good choices are out of reach. Groceries are readily available in a food swamp, but only the kind that boost your blood pressure, narrow your arteries, exhaust your pancreas, and overburden your kidneys. Food swamps have more recently been described by the contemporary food activist Karen Washington as forms of food apartheid, because the geography of food access of these areas so closely maps onto racial disparities. This racial disparity in turn maps directly onto differences in who suffers from diabetic amputation and who receives the care that helps to avoid this horror. This is a map from the ProPublica article provided by Dr. Fakorede. On the left, you have the average number of amputations in the US in the early 21st century. On the right, you have a map of the percentage of the enslaved population in 1860. Nearly 140,000 diabetes-related amputations occur every year in the US. Black people are 4 times as likely, and Native Americans twice as likely to undergo limb amputation for diabetes as whites. The racial geography of the plantation, one that made some bodies disposable and others sources of wealth, persists in our maps of disease and consumption today. The industrial diet extracts single elements of food from the environment and then produces that food intensively at large scale, refines it, purifies it, and ships it off for sale. We could call this monoculture in agricultural terms, but in more metaphorical terms, we might call it a loss of relation, a loss of a set of connections. In her stunning prose poem, A Woman with No Legs, the Mojave poet Natalie Diaz writes of visiting with an elder with diabetes who's lost both of her legs. And this, I'm going to zoom in on a few passages so you can see it a little better. The older woman lies in her bed, and when her grandchildren visit, she asks them to run around the room as fast as they can so that she can have the pleasure of watching them run. Quote, the whole time she whoops, faster, faster, end quote. And she herself dreams of running as a child, but lying in bed, she's no longer able to participate in the social world that once held her, no longer part of, quote, church services, cakewalks, or Indian Day parades. At the end of the poem, the elder tells Diaz that a white man has taken her legs. She, quote, told me to keep my eyes open for the white man named Diabetes, who is out there somewhere carrying her legs in a red biohazard bag tucked under his arm. Asked me to rub her legs, which aren't there, end quote. While the image of the biohazard bag is lurid, it's nonetheless to some degree accurate, because it is, in fact, the white man's diet that has taken her legs. You might say, and in fact many do say, that it's up to her to eat right, not up to someone else. But in the world of food apartheid, where there's no food or affordable food, say frankenfood, the matter of choice or self-discipline is something of a red herring, or at the very least, a vast oversimplification of a very long history that has to do with extraction, capitalism, and loss of relation. Diabetes has stole the elder's ability to walk, to dance, to run, and to literally have contact with the earth. The severing of sugar from the environment and adding it back has caused a loss of relation, including among the very parts of her body. Okay, I am going to give very short shrift to the milk portion of this work in the interest of time, but I want to show a few slides. My main reason for including milk among this kind of triad, and especially with a real focus on breast milk, is that we may tend to think of breast milk in terms of intimacy and family as a very kind of private relation, but it's also part of the historical food chain and subject to the kind of relations imposed, or we might say destroyed, by racial capitalism and monoculture. I can't help but share one little item with you, which is that Christopher Columbus initially thought the world was round, but then he changed his mind and posited that, in fact, the world was pear-shaped. He said that it was shaped like a pear, at the top of which was a woman's nipple, and on the top of the nipple was the Garden of Eden, which he believed that he had found in South America. So this image is one that posits the New World as a kind of breast to be, from which milk can be extracted. And that sense of the New World as breast ripe for European extraction, I think, appears vividly in a cartouche of an 18th century map. On the right hand, we see a Native American woman nursing 2 infants. On the left hand, we see a European sailor packaging commodities up into bales that are being put on ships and sent to, presumably to Europe for sale. What's amazing to me is the fact that this, that the legend, am I gonna get, oh, here we go, draws a direct line from this woman to this commodity. Right? And then one of my other ways of thinking about this is really partly through the stunning work of the artist Kara Walker, who in a very famous work from 2014 called A Subtlety or the Marvelous Sugar Baby, constructed this giant kind of mammy sphinx figure who's surrounded by the figures of small black children who are working. I think it gives us, it connects this sense of sugar as extractive with also the way in which the labor of black women has been turned towards the reproduction of whiteness and white children at the expense of their own children. Okay, and this section ends with a discussion of the contemporary formula crisis, which is really one created by agribusiness. There are 4 companies today that control the formula supply in the United States. One of them has bacteria in their factory. It causes the kind of crisis that we've seen with the lack of supply of formula. This is a crisis that hits black and brown women particularly hard, in part because 50% of the formula sold in the United States today is sold to the US government and used for the WIC program, Women and Infant Children. So it is given to low-income women who are disproportionately women of color. And so here I want to just make the point that again, we have a story of forced production that moves into a story of forced consumption, that moves into a story of kind of corporate profit. All right, so I hope that makes sense. I'm moving quickly there. All right, so the last section here, honey. Honeybee is not native to North America. Honeybees first arrived on American shores on a 300-ton British ship named the Sea Venture, which was launched from Gravesend, England, to ferry supplies to the Jamestown colony in Virginia in 1609. But the ship foundered in a hurricane off the coast of Bermuda, leaving more than 150 passengers to find their way to shore with what supplies they could rescue. Although the Sea Venture never reached Jamestown, it left a stunning legacy. The account of the storm and the wreck written by survivors formed the basis of William Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. And the Sea Venture's cargo included hives of the first honeybees to reach America. So European colonials brought honeybees with them and relied heavily on them for caloric and agricultural needs. In our century, however, the honeybees that accompanied colonizers face an existential threat, a disease known as colony collapse disorder. Bees are microfauna, a largely invisible but crucial link in the food chain. Bees are relied upon today by agribusiness not for producing sweetness, but for performing the sexual relation of plants, for fertilizing up to 80% of the food that we eat today. In their scarcely visible but essential role, bees perform the work of creating and sustaining a crucial ecological relation. And in some ways, for me, bees are almost a literal manifestation of the relation, of the metaphor of relation, of connection. They embody connection as they move from male to female flowers, transporting the seed of the male ovary to that of the female plant. And I can't help but add that if you know the expression, the bee's knees, when something is really great, you say, it's the bee's knees. If you don't know it, now you do. You can use it, whenever you like. That's because bees store pollen in sacs on their knees. And so you can see all that pollen that this bee is kind of tucked into her, into the sac on her knee as she flits around. So bees are, of course, amazing and endlessly fascinating. But the disease that's decimating the bees is one that takes aims at hidden connection. CCD, colony collapse disorder, and the death of the bees springs from the stresses of a system coming apart at the seams and losing the diverse sets of relations that hold our environment and food chain together. So what exactly has caused the death of the bees? In late January of each year, some 80 million bees arrive in the Central Valley of California from around the country, transported not on their wings, but on the flatbeds of 18-wheeler trucks stacked with 450 hives apiece. Workers transport these 2.5 million hives on pallets, lifting them with forklifts and depositing them in clumps at the end of row upon row of soon-to-blossom almond trees. As February unfolds and the almond buds unfurl, 1.3 million acres of almond trees will be fertilized by the bees, each of whom is seeking nectar in the depths of an almond blossom, each carrying dusty spores of pollen from the anther of a male blossom to the stigma of a female blossom. 1 million such acts of facilitated sexual relations results in an annual crop of 3 billion pounds of almonds. More than 90% of all commercial bees in the US attend this annual event, one that the commercial beekeeper John Miller refers to as the big dance. This was a dance that I attended this year, as you see there. On a tour of the almond groves on Bullseye Farm in Woodland, California, Miller invites a listener, namely me, to listen among the acres of blooming almond trees to the nearly thunderous hum of 8 million bees transferring pollen from one popcorn-shaped bloom to the next. But for the commercial beekeeper, the vibrant hum of this mass conception of new life is tempered by the equal likelihood of death, one that always looms as a possibility when prying open the battered wooden lid of a hive to check on the bees inside. Chris Hyatt, another commercial beekeeper at work in the Central Valley almond grove, starts the day on his farm in Fresno with a crew of workers scraping out the guts of dead hives into a massive pile of blackened bees and combs. He has many healthy hives, but a die-off rate of more than 1/3 of the hives is not unheard of for commercial beekeepers. And that entire stack of hives behind that worker those are all dead hives. This is just their job to scrape them out. So prior to the year 2000 or so, commercial beekeepers made most of their money on the sale of honey. But now beekeepers rent out the pollinating services of bees to farmers and do so at increasingly larger scale. The extraction of honey from bees has accelerated and transformed in the 20th century into the extraction of the labor of pollination. The bees that pollinate the trees in California are subject not only to arduous travel, but to the toxic chemical soup of the Central Valley, where pesticides are used on crops of all kinds. And bringing this number of bees together from disparate locations is also a little like sending your child to daycare. Viruses spread unrestricted there and are then transported home. Agribusiness extracts reproductive labor from bees, but agricultural monoculture at a multinational scale has exhausted honeybees to death. This crisis of CCD has also brought a new wave of beekeepers into the world, backyard and urban beekeepers, many of whom are quite attuned to the connections between the plight of the bees and the ravages of monoculture, capitalism, and colonialism. In Detroit, for instance, a resurgence in beekeeping is directly linked to the environmental and racist depredations of industrial capital. Bees, as it turns out, are much happier in the urban space of Detroit than in the well-groomed suburbs where lawns are denuded of weeds and wildflowers, or in the monocultural fields of agribusiness. Detroit is a city left behind by globalization, and it has increasingly begun to be reclaimed by the prairie, generating weeds, wildflowers, and the biodiversity that provides bees with the nutrition to stay alive. Responding to the destruction left in the wake of global capital's restless predations, many Detroit natives have worked to establish new ways of living on and relating to the land of the city. In 2017, Timothy Paul and Nicole Lindsay began purchasing empty lots in Detroit and using them to house bee farms. Their nonprofit organization, Detroit Hives, sells local honey and involves schools and community members in gardening and beekeeping. The plans for the organization evolved out of Paul's discovery that local honey was able to cure his intractable respiratory infection. With a similar origin story, the Zach and Zoe Sweet Bee Farm, a Black-owned business in New Jersey, began in 2015 when the owners found that their son Zach's asthma and allergies responded well to the treatment of local raw honey. Asthma, like type 1 diabetes, is a disease caused by the immune system running amok. In the case of asthma, an overaggressive immune system response to environmental triggers causes inflammation of the airways until breathing becomes difficult, if not impossible. Like diabetes, asthma is epidemic in the US and disparately affects communities of color. But honey seems to reduce inflammation of the airways, most likely because of the nutrients that bees are able to pack into the syrup. The sweetness of local honey soothes the body rather than inflames it. Beekeeping enables what some scholars have called ecological rapprochement, a term that uses the language of politics to capture a sense of reconnecting people and nature. Bees make visible and build relations among people, plants, insects, and land. The medicinal and health effects of honey are directly tied to the land and the specific flowers that the bees alight upon. But ecological rapprochement is not the purview of beekeeping or honey alone. The example of beekeeping movements today points to a model of food justice and food sovereignty that suggests how we might change our relation to sweetness in life-giving and peaceable fashion. The chef and food activist Bryant Terry points out that cooking and eating in social gatherings is a political act because it resists the big food effort to atomize us, one that encourages us to eat alone in our cars while driving from one job to the next. Effortlessly and endlessly available glucose impoverishes our social relations and diminishes our communities of belonging and care. So, to conclude, I want to suggest that sweetness might better be understood in terms of living in common rather than in terms of consuming commodities. It's sweet to eat cake, but life should be sweet not just because we're eating cake, but because we're doing so together. Milk, sugar, honey. None of these substances, I would posit, is intrinsically bad or good. We need glucose to live, but we also need relations of belonging that sustain the sweetness of being in community, and we need bigger stories, stories that reweave and valorize the forms of relation that monoculture aims to destroy. We need bigger stories that make visible and hold together the sweetness of life-giving relations and connections. Thank you very much, and may we all eat cake together soon.
So as usual, there are a few questions, but we have a few minutes, so feel free to add a few more. So, you are a literary scholar, but your work is also very historical. Could you talk a bit about how your background as a literary scholar informs your work?
As an 18th century scholar, a lot of my work is necessarily very historical. So there's always this sort of question, like, are you doing history or are you doing literature? And so I tend to think of the work, my training and my thinking as a literary scholar that sort of deeply informs my methodology. I think through literature, and I think literature allows us to think in different ways about connections across time and across domains and issues of causality. So I I used a few examples here, of, for instance, of the Diaz poem, and also the fact, for instance, that axe does not appear anywhere except for in literary texts, right? It's not in the archive. It's not in the historical archive. I also think that literary texts, I often move I feel like it allows me to move my argument to different locations. I'll just say a few kind of important literary texts for this project include Toni Morrison's Beloved, where she talks about the experience of Sethe essentially being, I guess you call it being raped by the school teacher, her enslaver's 2 sons, who hold her down and steal her milk from her breasts that was for her children. And she, in the novel, Sethe repeats, but they took my milk, right? And that whole question of what it means to have one's milk taken, one's milk that was meant for one's child, right, is so powerful in that text. Anyway, there's a lot of text, but that's a good example, I think, of how literature allows us to think of the dimensions of these histories in different ways that are really, I think, kind of at the heart of the work that I do.
So there is a lot of emphasis, obviously, in your talk about the problems related to monoculture, right? You've talked extensively about it. Is there any sustainable solution to this issue, given the number of people that we have on the planet? And
to monoculture? Mm-hmm. Yeah, stop. Stop monoculture. I think one of the, in kind of agricultural terms, one of the exciting recent developments is the systems of regenerative farming. I included a slide of that, but I was able, when I was visiting the bees in California, I was able to attend a regenerative farming kind of training session / conference for almond farmers. And it was held at this farm where, so regenerative farming is really based on a philosophy that you don't monocrop, you don't till the soil, you don't use pesticides, and you use a variety of plants and animals. So at this farm, they had stopped using any pesticides. They let all of the foliage grow underneath the almond trees, and it turns out that's amazingly good for the bees. The bees don't die because they're not just relying on almonds in order to. It was like if you had to eat almonds for 2 months, it would not be very good for you, only almonds, right? So they have the forage that's available because it's growing under the trees. You don't have to pay for pesticides. The insects start growing, and when the insects are growing, then you also have animals that come back. They use sheep to graze underneath the trees, and then, amazingly, when you have this land that is not totally denuded of any biological material, it turns out that it's not as hard as concrete, and when it rains, the water goes into the soil instead of running off. So I'm not going to get the number right, but you literally need like 40% less water when you use these regenerative farming techniques. And so given the crisis of the water crisis in California, it's just amazing how many problems it solves in order to if you start using this kind of regenerative farming. And it was very exciting to be there. I asked a lot of people, like, why haven't you always been doing this? And and people said, well, that's not the way. These are farmers. That's not the way we were taught to do it, right? So there is this sort of. It feels like it's going. There were a lot of people there from the from the California universities, they're forgetting the name, they're sort of agricultural services for the community, who were they wanted to learn about regenerative farming so that they could then train farmers who needed help in this. So I do think that there's real possibilities over there, and it's, to get back to literature, it's a failure of imagination not to think about the ways that we could change these systems that may seem like they've always been there. They haven't been, and they don't need to be.
So there are two questions related to the milk part of your talk. One very general that asks, can you tell us more about this part of the book? But the other one is that you mentioned formula companies. Does the discouragement of breastfeeding by these companies and their practices fit into the milk part of your narrative? So can you tell a bit more about that?
Absolutely. The formula companies are not doing good work. There is, of course, this massive debate about breastfeeding versus formula, and I'm not so interested in wading into that as I am making it clear the ways in which that choice is actually not given to so many women, right? Who are, for instance, poor women who are given free formula at the hospital to take home, who are not given. Black women are 9 times more likely to be given free formula at the hospital and no training in breastfeeding. I mean, breastfeeding takes a village, right? It's not just, it doesn't just happen, right? It's something that you need to learn how to do. You need to have space to do it. You need to have time to do it. You need to have the resources to do it. And the promise of formula company is like, oh no, you don't need any of that. I'm going to wade into some really, just briefly if I can, some really fascinating work that I learned about from a scientist recently who's working on the chemistry of milk. It turns out that breast milk has a large component of complex sugar called oligosaccharides. And oligosaccharides are, people couldn't figure out what they were doing in breast milk because babies literally can't digest oligosaccharides. They don't have the enzymes to do it. They discovered maybe a decade ago that oligosaccharides feed a specific kind of bacteria in the intestine of an infant. And when this bacteria, Bifidobacterium infantis, I like saying that because it makes me sound kind of scientific. When you feed this bacteria, it colonizes the infant intestine in such a way that it prevents the intestine being colonized by other bacteria that could be very threatening. And second of all, it trains the human immune system. So infants who have a large population of the Bifidobacterium infantis do not get autoimmune diseases like diabetes, like asthma, like eczema, like allergies, right? This bacteria is almost non-existent in the Western world today. It's only found in infants because of hygienic practices, because of antibiotics, and because of formula. It's found in Bangladesh, in sub-Saharan Africa, and these scientists have now found a way that they can reintroduce it into infants' intestine. And then if you feed it with oligosaccharides, then it does colonize the intestine with all these wonderful ways. Also, the baby doesn't poop so much because the oligosaccharides aren't going through, they're feeding the bacteria. So I think there's a lot that, and the company that the UC Davis scientists made is now being sued by the formula companies. So there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that the formula companies prevent us from, discourage us from knowing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This was a terrific presentation and great responses. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you to the audience as well, here and online. Thank you for joining us today. You can see next programming here at Radcliffe and video of past programs at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.